We talk a lot about food allergies and gluten sensitivity, but could you be allergic to your cell phone? That's the question we're going to be answering today on Dr. Osborne's Zone. I've got special guest and EMF expert, Nicholas Pineault. He's an independent journalist. Now, he's sometimes referred to as the EMF Guy. He's got a book on the subject called the Non-Tinfoil Guide to EMFs. And he's going to do a deep dive with us today. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. You unlock this door with the key of compassion. Beyond it is another world, a world of science, a world of common sense, a world of sanity. You're moving into a land of both empathy and ethics, of nutritional knowledge and empowerment. You've just crossed over into Dr. Osborne's Zone. So today we've got Nick Pineault. He is an independent journalist, and he is fastly becoming an expert in the field of electromagnetic radiation and other forms of electro smog, if you will. Thanks, Nick, for tuning in and being here today to share your expertise with us.
Thanks for having me. It's a real honor.
So could you first talk about just what are the symptoms of EMF exposure that are common that people might suspect they're being exposed in a nefarious way to EMF?
Yes, well, it varies greatly, and that's what makes it a little bit tricky. The top symptoms that have been identified by doctors who treat electrosensitives include fatigue, insomnia, which, I mean, you'd be pretty fatigued if you have insomnia, of course, low energy, but also depression, anxiety. And then there are certain symptoms that are even more telling of people that are more on the hypersensitive spectrum, including heart palpitations from certain devices. If you're near a Wi-Fi router or a computer, or even cell phone towers, in some cases, can give people a weird feeling with that their heart rhythm is off. And when they get away, it will fade. And that's also part of how to verify if these exposures are really causing your symptoms. Is sometimes you can pinpoint that there's causality. You're near a computer, you don't feel well. You're not near the computer, you feel okay. Headaches are also very common. There are also skin rashes that are even more telling as a sign, because literally I've heard from people who, if they're near a computer on Wi-Fi, they would see their skin becoming pink. And there are good reasons to think that's because there's a histamine release from mast cells that migrate at the surface of the skin. And we have plenty of data on this. So literally, some people are more allergic to radiation than others, which is quite bizarre if you think about it. It's not a food, or it's something invisible, and yet it's very true. And another one I'll mention is tinnitus, because for some people it really looks like it's causing this ringing in the ear for them, which is can be quite debilitating. So I have to say that these symptoms will sometimes mimic other conditions. So some people think, okay, it must be food, or it must be chemicals, but sometimes it's also EMF. So it's very hard to pinpoint in which cases EMF is a big problem, but it can vary for each person. And it looks like individual sensitivity and your likeliness of developing these different symptoms will vary a lot from one person to another. And the unfortunate part is that if you feel sick from an exposure, an EMF exposure, or an everyday gadget, but your spouse does not, it makes it difficult for them to believe you. So the hard part, and even the part for practitioners that is hard, is believing the person with their subjective symptom, which sometimes could be, something psychosomatic. It exists. But most of the time, what is found in the data is that, no, this is a physical thing, and it has nothing to do with what they think about EMFs, because in many, many situations, the exposure is first, then the patient feels sick, and then they figure out that EMF was the cause. So it's not the nocebo effect where they fear EMFs. It is very rare that this is the case. So it gives even a stronger ammunition to the case that it's really EMFs that are causing these issues.
Who would have thought being allergic to your cell phone would become a thing?
Yeah,
Very interesting.
exactly.
If we could, by helping the audience understand, what's the difference between EMF and radio frequency and some of the other, because we have cell phone radiation, we have microwave radiation, we have all these different types. Could you kind of break it down for the average layperson to understand it better?
Sure. So there are, of course, the natural types of EMFs that we've co-evolved with in nature. Namely, it goes from the extremely low frequency of EMFs, such as the Schumann resonance emitted by the planet Earth. We know that we need this type of low-level radiation in order to feel connected to the planet. In fact, there are some studies showing that if you isolate people and exclude completely the Earth's magnetism, you get into trouble. Even your circadian rhythm is linked to it. But also in the much higher frequencies, we have the visible light spectrum, and we know that sunshine is super important for the circadian rhythm, for your hormonal optimization. And then vitamin D, especially the research in the last several years, have confirmed that this is an important part of immunity that is provided by regular sunshine exposure. When you have sufficient UV exposure and your skin is transforming this sunshine exposure in vitamin D, and it acts as more like a hormone rather than a vitamin. So it is a key component of health. So these are natural types of EMFs, just a few examples, but we have also unnatural types of EMFs. Let's say human-made EMFs that we've introduced to the environment in the last few hundred years, in the case of electricity, especially the last 100. And then we have even newer type of exposures in the form of wireless communications that we've introduced through the advent of the cell phone, and then eventually Wi-Fi, and more recently so Bluetooth. So all of these are example of man-made EMFs, and radio frequency radiation can encompass cell phones and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and cell towers, for example. And a slice of radio frequency radiation can be called microwaves, and these are literal microwaves that are emitted by your phone, and that's in fact a signal that is similar to a microwave oven, although at a much, much lower degree in intensity, or else we would be cooking ourselves, which is not the case. But what we're interested in the scope of this science is not necessarily how much this radiation is heating tissue, just like inside a microwave oven. It is the case that, your food can heat and in fact be completely, boiled or burned by a microwave oven. That's not what's happening at this level of radiation, but we're interested in the non-thermal effect of this radiation. And there are many reasons to think that they include oxidative stress, and also the changes in how the cells behave. For example, the change in how certain ion channels will act on the cell level. And not to get too deep into the science, but how I think about it is that we are bioelectrical beings. Many parts of our bodies act with electricity or use electricity or display electrical signals we can read, such as the brain, the heart rhythm, and all sorts of different body parts, including at the cell, and then deeper at the mitochondrial level. And then if we include or if we expose ourselves to outside sources of electricity that do not contain the right information, it becomes a sort of noise to these sensors on our body. So we're really talking about bioelectric interference, in a sense, how our external use of man-made EMFs is interfering with our natural ability to use electricity at the cell level.
That makes me think a lot about the electromagnetic pulse technology, where you emit a nuclear blast that has such an electromagnetic field of a pulse that it can interfere with the way electrical gadgets and electricity in our world, would normally function. So it only makes sense to me that, if we're being exposed to these fields at higher rates for that aren't natural, that it could potentially impact or affect us electrically as well. As you mentioned, the heart is an electrical organ, the brain is an electrical organ, the nervous system is an electrical organ. Okay, so we have this new technology, right, that's been rapidly increasing over the last several decades as would you call it safe? I mean, the big argument that I always see and hear is, of course, everybody uses a cell phone, therefore they can't possibly be dangerous. The government would never allow for something so
Yeah.
dangerous to be used by everyone. And of course, I can think of a lot of reasons why the government doesn't care. Could you talk to that? Could you talk to the recent, or not recent, but the lawsuit the FCC lost on safety? Can you speak to that
Yes.
a little bit?
For sure. So in 2021, the FCC is the Federal Communication Commission in the USA, and they are supposedly responsible for health. Whether they're really doing it or not is another question, but they had to review their EMF guidelines. So the amount of this radio frequency radiation and other types of man-made EMFs that are allowed in the population, and whether that's safe or not. And they were supposed to look at the scientific evidence. They basically closed this entire responsibility they had an analysis by saying, no, we're not going to change anything. But then they got sued by activist groups, which included many independent scientists and many doctors that do not agree with their presumption that everything is safe. And it went to the judges, and they lost in court. The FCC was slapped by on the wrist by these judges who said, clearly you have not reviewed the science, so you need to go back to the drawing board and present something better. And so far they've been stalling this case for 3 years, but it means that in the meantime, all we know is that the rules that are in place that are supposed to protect citizens against this radiation are not appropriate. What is the safe level of EMF? We don't have this determination at the moment, even around the world. There are different nations that have much, much, much lower level of allowable EMFs in the population, including different rules around the placement of where cell towers should be and what is considered a safe distance from a cell tower, and also including what is the safe amount of Wi-Fi we should have in schools. So when you look at different governments and what their health agencies have found, it will vary widely. In the US and in Canada, for that matter, where I live in Montreal, they would say you can be exposed to any of these devices at any distance for any amount of time, and you're perfectly fine. This is what they would claim. In other countries, they would say these exposures are extremely dangerous. For example, at I saw news in Italy a few years ago where they had this mast, the cell phone tower in a public park that was measured too high compared to their limits that are much lower than what is the allowable limit in Canada and the US. And the mayor of that city said, this is very dangerous. We're going to close out the park. We're going to replace the mast, or, lower the levels to something that is allowable. But in the meantime, the same levels and even higher levels than that were seen in the US and Canada. And these towers were starting to be installed in 2019 and 2020 in that 5G network rollout that was starting to take place, where antennas are being installed closer and closer to where people live. So there's a flagrant disregard of, I guess, the science that Italians are looking at when it comes to North America. And that's really where you see certain governments, I think, follow the precautionary principle much closer, where they say maybe there's uncertainty around the data, but the indications we have, we should really err on the safe side of things, because many times in history we got things wrong. They got things wrong around asbestos and leaded gasoline, and many agents were rolled out and did damage to a population, only to discover later with epidemiology, which is of course the science of counting body bags. Let's face it, unfortunately. You study the populations and see, I guess, yes, asbestos led to lung problems, or smoking led to lung cancer. So we have similar data now with EMFs, namely just the cancer link is stronger and stronger. And it is all this radio frequency, including your phone, and the device you might be using to listen to this very interview. It is a class 2B carcinogen, and that's the determination from the International Agency for Research on Cancer back in 2011. That's already 13 years ago. So it's quite an old decision at this point. And the new data we have is sufficient for certain scientists to say, it should be reclassified as a class 1 carcinogen. So class 1 is asbestos and smoking. So in that sense, many scientists are saying, look, this is the new smoking. These EMFs are really the smoking of the 21st century.
That's pretty alarming when you think about it. So you mentioned a lot of these towers going up around 2019. There's some researchers that believe that the 1918 flu pandemic that swept across the world was actually electricity being first instituted in major public spaces. What are your thoughts, or have you talked to any experts on the rollout of these towers and the rollout of 5G in many places around the same time as COVID? Because a lot of the symptoms, well, first, we'll talk about that in a minute, but a lot of the symptoms of cold and flu can actually coincide with EMF damage. What are your thoughts, or what are the experts that you've interviewed have to say about that?
There's a little bit of data showing that the more electropolluted a city is when they take levels, and the more people are prone to flu-like illnesses. And there's good reasons to think that radiofrequency radiation as an environmental pollutant will impair the immune system. And it's not that much of a stretch, because if you look just at the studies around sleep quality, we clearly see that cell phones can impair our ability to sleep soundly because it will interfere with brain waves. Again, we go back to a bioelectrical component. Our brain needs to go in certain cycles while we sleep, and it displays these brain waves that we can measure. And when researchers looked at it back in 2008 and even before that, but in 2008 there was a set of studies in healthy participants who do not necessarily feel like they have bad sleep. These are not autoimmune patients, or these are not electrosensitives, just healthy men who tried to sleep with a phone next to the head. 30 minutes of exposure was basically led them to have a sleep onset delay of 1 hour. In other words, they were insomniac for an hour after that exposure. So it looks like it's really preventing the brain from doing its job right and falling asleep. Instead, it's keeping you in a state that is not really sleep and not really being awake. So it is interfering with normal functioning. So imagine that instead of the phone now, I tell you that we have installed cell towers everywhere, and maybe there's a health effect from that. Well, it's not that much of a stretch to think that we maybe are impairing the sleep of the entire population in cities more so than in the countryside because of the densification of this electro smog, so to speak. So I think there's many reasons to think that it is becoming harder to keep a good immune system in a city where this electro smog is higher compared to back in, ancestral levels that we had a few generations ago.
Are there research studies that you've come across? So sleep has been affected. What about behavior, neurological, psychiatric behaviors? Are you seeing any research studies or talking to any scientists that have made any linkages or associations or even causation to things like ADD and ADHD, or to things like brain fog, dementia, depression, etc.?
Yeah, the strongest data there is in pregnant moms who are exposed to more cell phones and the risk of their children developing ADD, ADHD symptoms, or even food allergies in certain tests, in certain sets of epidemiological studies. The main researcher that I follow on this is Dr. Hugh Taylor at Yale. So some of these scientists are quite mainstream, which is very frustrating and alarming to me, because we're not talking about, what people online would say, oh, these are fringe scientists or not serious, or, low impact journals and all of this. No, you have people from Yale, you have Dr. Martha Herbert at Harvard also, who emitted strong concerns over the fact that unborn fetuses are likely to get more epigenetic changes and effects on a developing brain compared to adults. And this is barely being studied as we speak. But the data that Dr. Hugh Taylor looked at, in his opinion, is causative. He said there's a cause and effect. When you expose yourself more as a pregnant mom to the cell phones or other machines that emit this radiation, your offspring will have double the risk of developing behavioral issues. So is it that it's a sort of stimulatory effect where the nervous system is riled up and you just develop like that. We know that the fetus, when it's forming, is sensing not only the mom's feelings and reality and diet, but also the environment. So if we introduce an agent in the environment that is, let's say, threatening to the nervous system or stimulatory, there's a chance that it will, let's say, be recorded by the body, and then later in life we might see impact. So we don't know to this day how much is this contributing to what we're seeing in youth, but it's certainly not helping. And given the fact that there's almost half of children in America now that have chronic issues of all types, including obesity and different autoimmune conditions, I think it deserves to be looked at. The problem is that in most discussions, we're only focusing on food, only focusing on habits and different things, and forgetting the environmental component, especially EMFs.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunately going to be one of those things that catches us so quickly. We're going to have to possibly backtrack on a lot of what we have approved as generally, or not approved, but have assumed as being safe. Are you seeing any connection with or correlation with the development of different types of autoimmune disease? You mentioned allergies, you mentioned some behavioral issues in pregnant women who are exposed more so. What about other kinds of diseases? Any other connections that you've seen the scientific community make?
There's not a lot of data on the development of autoimmune diseases, but there's one researcher in particular, Professor Trevor Marshall, who is a researcher in autoimmunity. He published a paper back in 2017 where he looked at, I think it was more than 80 different patients with different autoimmune issues. And what he did was a bit unusual. He had them wear an EMF shielding cap. And literally, the tinfoil hat that some people laugh at. Well, they used that in that study. And he found out that 90% of autoimmune patients responded very positively to wearing this during the night. So they had a sleep improvement. And what he said is this. He said, given that a lot of studies estimate the amount of electrosensitivity, the prevalence of electrosensitivity that is in the population to about 3 to 5%. He said, well, that's unusual that 90% of these patients are getting better. So therefore, either you have autoimmune patients are that much more likely to also suffer from electrosensitivity or get symptoms from these exposures, or be sensitive to this radiation, especially during the night. And he said that in the future, we need to look at this EMF mitigation, not only wearing, a cap, but lowering our exposure from devices or even shielding the bedroom, different strategies that can be applied to this. We need to consider this a new line of treatment for autoimmune issues. So he's one guy, right? But I think it's plausible that more and more we'll see autoimmune patients look at EMFs as a possible stressor that is keeping their body confused and in a state of inflammation. There's many reasons to think that it's impacting not only sleep, but there's many reasons to think that it's increasing inflammation in the body. So uncontrolled inflammation that becomes chronic might also be part of what is keeping people symptomatic with autoimmune issues.
Now, you mentioned protection. Couple of follow-up questions to that. Number one, are there devices that are accurate, that are available relatively inexpensively for the average consumer to be able to measure or quantify EMFs and radio frequencies being emitted in their home or in air, like hot spots in their house, for example? Is there a particular brand of machine or a particular type that you would recommend?
Sure. The one I use these days is called the SAM ProTac 33. That's from France. It's a great meter because it is very simple. I find that a lot of people purchase different detectors, and if the display is complicated and the units of measurement are confusing, it stays in a shelf, in the corner of the garage, and they forget about it. So that's a tool you can actually use, and that's a great detector that measures 3 different types of fields all at once with an LED system. And also it has the sound feature, which is quite important because sometimes Our environments are so polluted these days that if you open this detector, the chances are everything will be in the red zone when you approach anything. So just to detect different sources, it is useful, although I don't think it's needed to have one of these detectors to start mitigating things, because just using certain basic principles like creating distance from devices is a great way to get started and mitigate some of these risks.
Let's talk about, that was my second part of the question, was what, there are a lot of commercials now coming out on using these different types of devices to put on your phone or to cover your phone, or even devices in the house that you could, I've seen some of these copper coil devices that people are purchasing now. Let's talk about the science behind those strategies. Is there great evidence that shows that those things are valuable and are beneficial to people who use them?
It's flimsy. The entire line of evidence, all the science done around those is from the companies themselves, so prone to bias. And some hypersensitive individuals that are very, very sick and know that these EMF exposures are impacting them and causing symptoms, they find certain of these technologies helpful, but I don't consider them to this day protective. And that's really the difference. A reduction in symptoms does not necessarily equal a reduction in biological effects of EMFs. And that's something a lot of people confuse these two. So if I don't feel the exposure, I don't feel a headache, I'm safe. That's not correct, because we know many people who never felt a headache from their phone, and yet they can still develop a brain tumor, for example. So that's on a cellular level, the perception of harm does not equal what is happening, behind the scenes, so to speak. So it's really important to, if you discover that one of these devices has benefits to your life, that's fine, but it's not a replacement to lowering your exposure by turning off sources or creating distance. So I think that there's a lot of marketing and a little bit of science, but we don't have, I think, the scientific accuracy that we should have to really tell people, install a pyramid in your bedroom and now you're completely protected. This is, there's not one EMF scientist that I know of that endorses these devices. So to this day, some people find relief, and that's good. In fact, I talked to environmental medicine doctors in the scope of my new summit, the 2024 EMF Hazards Summit, and some of them find benefits for their hypersensitive patients. There are certain necklaces that you can wear, and I don't know the exact mechanism. Maybe it makes people more resilient, or maybe it's the placebo effect. I'm not sure. But if it helps them, that's fine. But these patients still need to turn off sources and minimize EMF exposure, or else it's like saying, no, don't worry about your nutrition. You can eat McDonald's and Wendy's as long as you take your vitamins. Doesn't work like that. You cannot mitigate, chronic exposure to something that is a stressor with a magic pill. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's why I asked the question, because I see a lot of people wearing necklaces and using these little buttons on their stuff, and I just, I'm very speculative about it. I think if it's relatively inexpensive, as you said, and it makes you feel better, then whether it's placebo or not isn't relevant, provided you're not spending thousands of dollars on something that has no actual beneficial purpose. Because you can create harm by creating financial distress, right? And people who would spend a lot of money on something that maybe is not very protective. Okay, so let's talk about mitigation strategies. So aside from the devices that people are looking at buying, you mentioned distancing, you mentioned, just distance being a strategy, and you also mentioned turning the power off to the device. So beyond those two things, so to me, the reason I would want a meter to be able to measure is to say, are there hot spots, particularly in my house, that I shouldn't sit in the morning and sit there all morning, right? And so maybe I move a chair over, or maybe I move the head of my bed away from a particular hot spot, where that way I'm not sleeping in a hot spot per se. But what about paints, wall materials that you can put in inside the wall, or et cetera? Are there other things that have been shown to be effective at shielding Wi-Fi or shielding EMFs in general?
Yes, for sure. Well, there's an order of priority to mitigation. I think the first line of defense is mitigating the bedroom, and that's more like starting to clean up sources. Because if you keep all the sources and then you get into shielding, you're kind of working backwards. First, try to not have a cell phone by your nightstand, or turn it off or put it on airplane mode. That's first. And that's just because of the compounding effect. If it impacts your sleep over time, this can be quite dramatic over a lifetime. So just to minimize the impact, make sure that in your bedroom there's no phone or laptop or tablet or Bluetooth sensors, Bluetooth alarm clocks. There's a lot of those these days. One study I saw talked about the amount of wireless devices in the average home, and one finding was 23 of them. So that's quite a lot. But I know that from experience, not personal experience, but from my colleagues who do EMF mitigation, one home had 150 different things in there. Because of the sensors, some people go with the smart home idea and everything is Bluetooth, every lamp, the toaster and everything. And it causes a home that is quite distressing to the body, especially for people who have already other chronic issues going on. So bedroom is first. And then I would say, just to avoid the biggest risks that we know this technology can have on your body, don't put the phone to your ear. Use speakerphone or use a wired solution, wired headset. I'm not a fan of anything Bluetooth touching the body either for extended periods of time, for the same reason. Bluetooth might be low energy, and sometimes it is true, sometimes not. Generally speaking, it's less intense than a phone, but it's still not at levels that can be considered any safer. So you're replacing one bad thing with another bad thing, essentially with Bluetooth. And the latest trend is Bluetooth earbuds. I must say that's a very alarming trend, because we barely have any data on Bluetooth. What we have in the determination, the class 1 carcinogenicity classification I told you about from top epidemiologists, this pertains to mostly 2G and 3G studies. Now we've moved with phones that have a Wi-Fi antenna, a Bluetooth antenna, and a 5G or 4G LTE antenna in there. And the Bluetooth earbuds are also deeper into the brain. And we have barely any studies on Bluetooth technology in itself. So our ability to study this stuff is so slow. It's a snail pace compared to our ability to, fast track all new technologies moving forward. So the argument that we should wait for determination of harm before taking action is pretty stupid in the end, because it will never happen. I don't think we're going to have EMF studies that are pre-market, because right now everything is post-market, and post in a way that is dramatic. So when you have mitigated the bedroom and mitigated the devices that are touching your body, also you can consider more advanced strategies such as shielding. And there are good reasons to think that people who suffer from autoimmune issues or other chronic issues would be better off sleeping in a room that does not have these exposures coming from the exterior. Because yes, you can turn off your own phone, you can turn off Wi-Fi at night, you can start using an Ethernet cable to connect your computer instead of Wi-Fi, and all these things are great. But what do you do against cell towers or neighbors that have Wi-Fi? You're always exposed to some degree, especially in cities, to this external sources of radio frequency. So what some people do, and that's a more advanced strategy that is quite an investment of time and money, is to completely shield the bedroom, either with a bed canopy over the bed, or the use of EMF blocking paint that is grounded, and then there's something over windows, either a film or some sort of fabric that is EMF blocking. So these strategies can be applied, and some doctors in environmental medicine recommend these strategies to patients, especially those who they find are the most electrosensitive. And how do they determine that? One, I wouldn't say easy, but relatively easy way to determine how electrosensitive you might personally be is to really get out of your usual environment. And doctors recommend this EMF vacation that they call. Really just go camping without your devices for 7 days and see how you feel. if you have the same diet, maybe you follow an autoimmune diet or a gluten-free diet, and you have a certain digestion that you have certain energy levels and a baseline in your normal environment, just keep a journal and see if you feel much better camping. If you don't, then maybe your environment is not that much of a problem. Maybe then you need to look at your diet and other things that you have control over. But some people sleep much better, and maybe their brain fog lifts, or they see other symptoms start to vanish after a few days, which shows them that not necessarily EMF is the culprit here, but their environment. So it might be work stress, it might be mold, it might be chemicals, maybe it's all of them, but EMF is part of the factors that is often overlooked.
Yeah, it's a new factor, and one that you're right. People oftentimes skip that part or don't want to give up the great conveniences,
Yeah.
Or benefits of using the technology. We were talking earlier about permeability factors associated with EMF, like leaky blood-brain barrier. Can you speak to that as a consequence of exposure?
For sure. Yeah, the link about the blood-brain barrier, radio frequency, and especially microwave back in the 1970s was being studied because military personnel were exposed very close to radars. Radars, in case people didn't know, it's also microwave radiation, like a cell phone tower, except it's quite strong. Sometimes it's stronger than a cell phone tower. And these people were working either, you're working in a submarine or working in different military bases where you have strong radars. And these operators were reporting, I don't feel well and there's something wrong. So this is where the early military research were starting to be done, because the military was interested to have troops that are combat ready, and they found that there are health effects. And to this day, this is still a line that's being studied. But right away, Alan Frey is the researcher, Frey, and he found an effect on the blood-brain barrier. And what he found is that when you are exposed, even at an extremely low level, there seems to be the blood-brain barrier is more permeable. So a sort of leaky blood-brain barrier. But to this day, we don't know what the clinical implications of that are, and it's been reproduced by different scientists. So I saw a discussion a few weeks ago, because I tend to be in different groups of discussion with scientists, and they said we still have no idea what the implications are. Does it mean that you're that much more likely to develop Alzheimer's, or is there a link with, different neuropsychiatric effects? We don't know exactly, but some researchers have the hypothesis that if it can impact the porosity of such a delicate barrier as the blood-brain barrier, what does it do to the gut barrier? And what does it do to other barriers, such as the testicular barrier that I didn't know existed? But you have barriers around very sensitive organs that are so thin and can easily be disrupted by changes in the environment, and even by chemicals for that matter. So it's still speculative at this point, but it's really a big question in my mind of how much radio frequency radiation is contributing to gut permeability, because a lot of the younger generation, me included, I rarely talk on the phone like this. I will text, and when I text, I bring the phone back to my navel, and would be texting over my heart or over my gut. And if it's contributing to gut permeability, then it means that it's not only the chemicals that might be opening our gut, but the radio frequency radiation, in which case it would be very, very smart for anyone who wants to keep a good immunity or even heal from certain autoimmune issues to avoid these exposures as much as possible.
Yeah. Have you come across studies or research? You're talking about talking about leaky gut as a potential. Leaky brain is something that's been more studied, but what about, and you mentioned the testes, so what about like sperm quality or fertility? I know a lot of people also carry their cell phones in their front pockets or in their back pockets, which is, proximity to, to the sex organs. Have you seen anything in the research, discussing that as a topic?
Yeah, especially in the last decades, the Cleveland Clinic fertility unit were really the pioneers studying cell phones in pockets of all people. So very mainstream, science, very prestigious institution. And they got some flack over these early studies, but it's been reproduced by several groups. So now the data on fertility and fertility loss or a decrease in sperm quality in men who keep a phone in the pocket is quite strong. In fact, you had Dr. Andrew Huberman, that's in the news everywhere on social media. He's a neuroscientist at Stanford. He reviewed the data on cell phones in the pocket and fertility, and he argues that the impact is even more credible and that the data is even stronger compared to BPA. And what people know, they know, everything is BPA free these days, and these plastics are an endocrine disruptor, so they're acting on our hormones and they're disrupting our ability to have the right hormones in our body. Well, it turns out that radio frequency radiation, even if it's hard to, I guess, wrap your head around that because it's not a chemical, but it has this electrical effect that is also an endocrine disruptor. So it is quite sad that to this day, these studies at the Cleveland Clinic were, again, 2008, 15 plus years ago, some of them 20 years old. And we had early indications, and yes, we needed more data, but to this day, most people still keep a phone in their pocket. The right behavior would be to, when you put it in your pocket, it's on airplane mode. And when you arrive at the office or you're in any situation where you're not, on the go, you could just put it in front of you. And it doesn't seem like a lot, right? Some people would ask, well, what's the difference between, my phone is at 2 feet or, right next to my genitalia? There's a huge difference. At 2 feet, the intensity drops by 90% already. So, keeping your phone not on your person might be one of your top priorities when it comes to mitigation for that reason.
That was my next question to you. What's you said 90% reduction 2 feet away.
Yeah.
Where do you get 100% reduction? Is it 3 feet? Do you know? Has anybody studied that?
A higher, sorry, what was it? 80% reduction?
100%. Where do you get
100%?
100%? Yeah.
Yeah, well, you never get 100% reduction because the signal goes in time and space. I think, if I understand the electromagnetic physics right, but to get no effect, that's the hard question. How far from your phone would you need to go to get zero effect on fertility? That's the right question. We don't have the determination of what are safe levels. The closest we have to what could be biologically compatible or safe levels is from the Bioinitiative report, and that's a collective of independent scientists that have been publishing on the topic, and they've put forward certain guidelines, but the problem is these levels are so low that we simply don't see how we could use cell phones at these levels at the moment. Maybe it could be possible in the future to engineer safe wireless technology, but I think we're not even there yet, in the sense that the first thing to acknowledge is, okay, we have a problem, there's a stressor in the environment, and yes, we agree it's a problem. Then we could lower to the minimum amount possible what the cell phone emits. At the moment, this is not what's being done. In fact, some engineers claim that we could reduce the amount of radiation your phone emits by several fold, and it would still work fine. So why are companies emitting so much radiation? Well, they're not incentivized by the rules that, of course, are by the FCC. Beginning of this conversation, if the FCC says it's perfectly safe, cell phone companies are not incentivized in any way whatsoever to shield against the radiation going towards your body with certain technologies that still exist, that already exist. In fact, these patents exist, have been created in the 80s by Nokia. They've been shelved. We have all these patents there that are dormant. Why? Because they have no incentive to go with the minimum amount of radiation possible. So we need to start applying these principles. But for the moment, what we're facing is a technology where it's always maximum amount of radiation. Why? Because they want great connectivity, and this is what they sell to users, right? Your cell phone will always be working, so why not go to the maximum in that case?
Which brands are you familiar with that emit the most radiation? So like if somebody's shopping for a cell phone or a personal device and they want to buy the one that has the least amount of radiative exposure, are there certain ones that are better buys?
Not really to this day. Some brands are slightly lower. I think the Samsung products, generally speaking, are slightly lower than iPhones, but they don't shield the antenna. They don't try to minimize. If they minimize cell phone radiation, it would be just an artifact of how they're designed almost. It would be almost a mistake on their part to have lower radiation. So it's not part of user demand, and it's not part of engineering requirements when they're creating phones. So I would say that regardless of any phone that you wear on your person, it wouldn't make it safe, even if it's lower EMF, to have it in your pocket, for example. So I'm very I'm a little bit hesitant to say, oh, this brand is low EMF, because some people will say, okay, well, maybe that makes it fine that I can talk on my phone now. It does not. We don't have any safe phones on the market. And what we have is some products are becoming to be lower EMFs, but we don't even know what the safe amount of exposure is yet. So I would say, that's a bit of a dangerous direction to take, is to look for low EMF products. Instead, a change of habits and creating distance is really a more reliable way to mitigate the risks.
What do you see happening in the future? I know you can't predict the future any better than anyone else, but the FCC seems to be a captured, they're captured by the
For
industry,
sure.
just like the FDA and pharmacy. But do we have a chance? What's going on? And you're in the forefront of all of this. So what do you see as coming out of this that's going to be protective of folks like us and other consumers?
Well, I mean, in the first place, this technology should not exist as it is right now. So the technology will need to be changed. It means everything will need to be replaced. There are steps that could be taken by the industry to start lowering the levels and also take action on their rollout of technologies. A good example of what happened and what could happen is the car industry. The car manufacturers were extremely reluctant to put seatbelts and airbags and new technology that would make cars safer. I wasn't around. I'm born in '87, but before that, it was really the public eventually became interested in safety, especially families that said, yeah, I mean, I would buy a car that is safer. And eventually, the government didn't have to force the industry to put safety features on cars. It was in fact a competitive advantage to do so. So very rapidly, when one car manufacturer starting claiming I'm the safest car, and of course you had the other car manufacturer that said, no, I am the safest car. So all of a sudden they competed on safety, and now cars are much safer than they ever were. And I think it's still a competitive advantage to this day, and they're getting safer and safer. So imagine if the same could happen with your phone, where you could have a phone with the lowest amount of radiation ever measured in mankind for a phone, and still great connectivity. So have the both worlds, right? The best of both worlds. I think that in the future, we can reach this point where we are much more reliant on Ethernet cables and wired technologies in many applications, because I see many wireless applications that are completely useless. If you had a wire, like for example, alarm systems can be hacked into these days, which make them pretty stupid in my mind. If hackers can get into your home and then open the door, isn't it pretty stupid? Or lock you in your home or things like that. And we have many examples to think that cyber security risks come from wireless also. So if you had a wire that connects your entire system, it means that no one can get in through a wireless signal. So I think that we're going to be less reliant on wireless and more on wires. And then the wireless that we will have will be placed strategically not near people, because we know that's not a good use. And also maybe the signals will be much more biocompatible, because we will have studied which frequencies and how to engineer a wireless signal that is less biologically active. So that's a direction that it could take. But I think that it will be a mix of legal actions and then grassroots movement to demand safer technologies. And we saw it with the gluten-free advent. And there's a lot of things that are wrong with that as well. I'm very well aware that like the cross-contamination, for example, is horrible. So you have celiac people buying something gluten-free, but it turns out it's full of gluten. But it still led to a societal change where awareness around certain food allergens has been increasing fast. And in fact, at one point, it became a competitive advantage for food companies to say, yeah, I'm going to show the allergens, or I'm going to do certified gluten-free products, for example. So maybe it takes just a societal shift of 10-20% of cell phone users demanding a safe phone, that maybe Apple will say, well, you know what, we're going to have a new line of products. And it does not make, of course, they're going to say, it does not make the older phones unsafe, but these ones are more compatible with your healthy lifestyle, right? They're going to come up with things like that. And something that I've seen is positive. I've connected with many engineers in the last few years, but especially this year, there are new companies that are emerging that are trying to compete with Apple. But we're talking about extremely small startups that want to create safer phones, that want to create safer tablets. And I think that people that are health conscious listening to this, they're craving for these solutions, because things shouldn't be unsafe. Like, users shouldn't be forced to be worried about what their computer is doing to them. The computer should be safe, but that's not the case. So I think that new companies will come to disrupt the market also. And if I were Apple, I would be worried over a 20 years period over if they miss the boat and don't think about health and don't think about reducing emissions. I think maybe they're going to regret it. They're going to lose a lot of market shares. And I think we're going to see a lot of new companies take this opportunity and create much safer devices for us.
Yeah, that's a very optimistic outlook. I'm hoping you're right. And markets always drive demand, right? That's the whole thing. And I think if we get this message out to enough people and give enough people the right amount of concern over their safety, over the safety of their families and their pets, then that will squawk enough to the people making and creating these products to give us some element of greater degree of safety. It's sad in a way too, because you should be able to buy food and not have to worry about buying organic food. Like, food should be organically, right? And
exactly.
So for the sake of food, right? It's the same thing, like you said, with your products. You should be able to buy a product that, isn't going to cause your sperm count to go down and cause leaks in your blood-brain barrier, and then you have to worry about cancer or other mental or
for sure
neurological problems. But it's almost like at this point it's an upsell. Like, here's the product, but then we'll upsell you the safe product, right? And so marketing. So I'm hoping everyone listening to this will call their politicians and their local folks and their phone carriers and their phone companies and say, look, we don't want to be radiated to death anymore. We want you to create safe products. So let that be a shout out to all of you listening to take your own actions so that we can move the needle on this. We moved the needle on gluten 20 years ago. Let's move the needle on cell phone radiation today. Well, this has been a great interview. I know we could talk a lot longer, but you've got a summit, and I think it would be probably better if people wanted to learn more about radiation from phones and other devices, to listen to you interview some of the best experts in the world, because that's not me. I'm not the expert in this category. And I think, could you speak to your summit and how people could tune in?
For sure. So the 2024 EMF Hazards Summit is the third edition of our annual summit, and I interviewed 20 experts on electrosensitivity and the dangers of EMFs. So we talk about solutions because some people do realize that they're sensitive, and some of them are in a state where they get worse and worse every year because it's very different. It's very difficult to avoid the agent in the environment. Imagine if you are not allergic to gluten, but now you're allergic to phones. Where do you go in a city to not find phones? You cannot. You cannot find anywhere. So it becomes very difficult to both live where you live and then also recover and get better. So these medical doctors I've interviewed, including Dr. Neil Nathan, talk about solutions for recovery. We also have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the presidential candidate, that talks about the FCC, the corruption of the FCC, but also the rights of electrosensitive folks. Because, of course, if a tower is erected right next to your home and is blasting you and you don't feel well, what kind of recourse do you have in front of the law? So we also talk about activism and how to get involved. So I hope that a lot of people tune in. It's April 11th to 14th, and I know you're gonna have links near the show notes and something like that, and in your newsletter too. For registrations, and the registration is free of charge. It's 20 interviews, 30 to 45 minutes, and I hope that people tune in and learn something valuable.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Nick, for putting it on, and thank you for being here today and sharing your knowledge with my audience. It's been very enlightening, and I really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this, and make sure you come back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and Thursday at noon 30 for more episodes.